Good morning. As I always start out and say, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. It's not somewhere that you have to go to. It's not like work and you are required to be here. It's a choice. And I come because God has done so much in my life. He has blessed me in so many areas. And you want to be able to share that. You want to be able to share it with others. You want to be able to explain why. And you want to explain a little bit about your journey. And you want to say to them, there's hope. There's always hope in Jesus. And so today, I'd like to share a little bit about the fig tree. And, the verse in Habakkuk where it says, even if the fig tree doesn't blossom. But before you go to that verse, I want to look at the fig tree itself. I want to talk about the fig tree. So many times sitting in the Bible, sitting under the fig tree was a common phrase. It symbolized peace and prosperity in the Bible. In 1 Kings 4:25, it says, Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all of Solomon's days. The fig tree was there. It's throughout the word. And then in Luke is the parable of the fig tree. Luke 13, it says, and he, Jesus, told them this parable. A certain man had a fig tree. He planted it in his vineyard, and he came back looking for fruit on it, but he did not find any. So he said to the vine dresser, see here, for these 3 years I've come looking for fruit on the fig tree, and I find none. He says, cut it down. Why should it continue also to use up all the ground, to deplete the soil, to intercept the sun and take up room? But the vine dresser said to him, leave it alone, sir, just 1 more year, till I dig around it and put manure on the soil. Then perhaps it will bear fruit after this. But if not, you can cut it down and out. That whole parable is really, it's God and how God, allowed Jesus to come, and he was here for those 3 years, 3+ years was his ministry, and he was laboring to bring forth the fruit of those. And, he was crying out and basically saying, let me nurture it that much more, wait, hold on, and let's see what can really happen. And really, it was from that point in time that the explosion really started to occur, because, Jesus was crucified, he left, and those 12 men, went on to shake the world. I mean, it's very difficult to think about, 12 men that have had any more or greater impact on the world, or lasted, that impact that lasted other than those, including, though you include Paul, you include all, it's just amazing. It's constant. There's nowhere you can go in the world that you do not know or hear about them. But another time, Jesus was coming. He was on his way to Jerusalem. He was going in for his triumphant entry, and then he would eventually go to the cross. And in Mark 11, 12, 14, he says, on the following day, when they have come away from Bethany, he was hungry. Jesus was hungry. And he said, seeing in the distance a fig tree covered with leaves, he went to see if he could find any fruit on it. For in the fig tree, the fruit appears at the same time as the leaves. But when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the fig tree had not yet come. That season had not yet come. And he said to it, no one will ever eat fruit from you. For this, his disciples were listening to what he said, and they were amazed. He cursed that fig tree, and that fig tree died. And so much, you begin to look at what was happening there. Well, here you have the fig tree that was blossoming. I mean, so much, if we look around our lives, and you see what's happening today, you see what's going on in the churches, and you see, everything seems and has a great appearance, but when you really look at it, how much fruit is, really coming from that appearance. And that's really what Jesus was looking at. He was looking at the Jews, and seeing all the people. And here he had spent those 3 years, and yet everywhere he went, because after he left that fig tree, he went into the temple. And in the temple, in Matthew 21:12-17, he said Jesus went in the temple, the whole temple enclosure, and drove out all who bought and sold in the sacred place. He turned over 4-footed tables of money changers and chairs, and those who had sold doves. He said to them, the scripture says, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And that's what we find so much today. So much of the church today is involved in merchandising. Much more. Much more. It was back then. I mean, here he is. He's on his way into Jerusalem. He's looking around. He curses the fig tree that has the appearance of everything that should bear fruit. He ends up going into the church or the synagogue of that time. And what's he see? He sees nothing but merchandising. And what does he say? My house should be a house of prayer. I mean, that's where we have to really look. I mean, in our churches today, it's more of a social gathering. Churches were there. Synagogues were there to pray. Synagogues were there to pray and deal with the very things that were afflicting them, dealing with them, hoping to come out from them. But what were they doing? They were selling their wares. They were merchandising. They were not doing what God wanted them to do. In the Old Testament, God would curse Israel because of their rebellion constantly. That's all you ever hear. When you see the fig tree, in Micah 7:1, he says, woe to me, for I'm as when the summer fruits have been gathered, as when the vintage grapes have gleaned, and there's no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig for which my appetite craves. He's seeing that around everywhere he looks, God, he's seeing that the people, they're choosing their rebellion, and it's the same today. The people are choosing their rebellion. They're choosing to oppose God. They're choosing to go against the very things and everything that he has for them. It's their choice of what they're doing. In Deuteronomy, it's 11:17, he says, and the Lord's anger will be kindled against you. He'll shut up heavens so there'll be no rain, and he will not yield its fruit. And you'll perish quickly off the good land which the Lord gives you. That's what constantly happened. Israel was always, here he is. He took them out of captivity. And it's our lives. I mean, I look at my own life, and I see where, God took me out. God took Israel out of Egypt, took them to the Red Sea, saved them. They crossed on dry land. He fed them. They were in the wilderness. He gave them everything they needed. 40 years he sustained them. Yet they still would come against God. They would oppose him. And really, that's been our lives. That's where we've been. I know even in my own self, that I came out of a lot of drugs. In 1972, I came to a church, and a church, really showed me the love of God, much like the Word of Faith did when I came to it. Even, Word of Faith was even a greater love. But when I came to that church, it helped me at that moment in time in my life to come off of drugs. I had been solidly on drugs for 4 years, 3.5, 4 years, every day. I would take LSD every third day. I'd take speed just to stay up. I had bags and bags of drugs. I had bricks of marijuana. I was in a non-existent state, and God took me out of that. But yet, even as he took me out, he says he sets us free to serve him and to worship him. But I began to get into my own desires. And the next thing I knew, I was in the music business. I was doing this, thinking I was doing all these things from God. It was like the fig tree. I had all the blossoms, but without all the fruit. And that's so many people that God has today. We have that appearance, but we're not bearing the fruit. And so God had to take me through many things. But I want to come now to the verse. I want to come to Habakkuk. And during Habakkuk's time, the wicked leaders in Judah were opposing the poor. And Habakkuk would sit there and he said, well, why does God allow these wicked people to prosper? And we look around, I can't forget how many times when I would be sitting there and I would say, why do all these what do they do? They're not doing what's right in God. Why do they have so much? But Habakkuk was doing the same thing. But it was even worse. He said, or how could God allow the Chaldeans to bring the judgment of God's people on God's people? He said they were more wicked than the wicked Jews. Sometimes we don't really understand God's ways or God's understanding. And his ways are so much different than we would ever perceive. You need to read, though, the second chapter of Habakkuk and then on into the third chapter, because you really begin to see the state of what things were. At that time, and he's saying, woe, woe, all you hear is woe. Woe to him who builds a town on blood. Woe to him who gives his neighbors drink, who pours out bottles to them and adds his poison. He says, for stone alone will cry out. And he says, you devise shame. Woe to him who obtains wicked gain for his house. This is what was happening in Habakkuk. This is what Habakkuk was yelling about. He says, these wicked leaders, they were oppressing, the poor. In Habakkuk 2:4, it says, look at the proud. His soul is not straight or right within him. And that's what the people were. They were proud. They were in their own self-sufficiency. They were doing what they wanted to do. They weren't doing what God wanted to do. So what happens then, he says, he says, look at the proud. His soul is not straight or right with him. But he says, the rigidly just and the uncompromisingly righteous man shall live by his faith and his faithfulness. We live by our faith. We trust God. In the midst of seeing all the things that are going on around us, we trust God. That's why what the next verse I'm going to read has become so important to me. I never really understood it much. I always would quote it, but then I would go away and think, well, really, do I really believe that? Do I really believe what it says? Because, all I did was strive for the success. All I did was go after all the things that, I wanted, in my life. I was set free from drugs, but then I didn't go on to serve God in the fullness of my life. I went on to serve a lot of what Ray was and a lot of what Ray wanted to do. And that's where this verse talks about. In Habakkuk 3:17, it says, though the fig tree does not blossom, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the product of the olive fails, and the fields yield no fruit, though the flock is cut out from the fold, and there's no cattle in the stalls. He says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt the victorious God of my salvation. See, that's where we need to come to. It's not because we're living in this the whole time of prosperity movement that was out there, all they cared about is name it and claim it, get it and, roll with it. I want the next Cadillac. I want the next, but the whole time, God had so much more for us. He takes us through all these things. The reason we suffer and we endure is to make us stronger in him. And he says, yet I'll rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt. What are we rejoicing? We're rejoicing because we don't have what the fig tree should blossom. We don't have the olive. We don't have the flocks. We don't have the cattle. We don't have the prosperity that, so many people tried and yelled about and talked about and claimed about. He says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt in the victorious God. The Lord God is my strength. He is my personal bravery. He's my invincible armor. He makes my feet like hinds' feet and makes me walk, not to stand in terror, but to walk and make spiritual progress upon my high places of trouble, of suffering, of responsibility. A deer, the hinds' feet of a deer, what they talk about is sure-footedness. The hind, the female deer, is known to traverse these large, mountains, to these cliffs almost. In our life, as he's saying, our troubles, our suffering, our responsibility. But God gives us those hinds' feet. Those hinds' feet are stability. He allows us to be in the midst of all the things that are going around, and all the failure, and all the lack of, and all the failure of the fig tree to blossom. He gives us hinds' feet to stand and traverse the trouble, to traverse the suffering, to traverse the responsibility, to make it. And that's what I've watched in my life, because, that deer, that female deer, it steps, and where it steps, it finds that foundation, it finds that strength, it finds that stability. And the next thing it does is it finds the next spot. And what does it do? It takes the hinds' feet and moves into the place where the front feet were, knowing that's the stable place. That's the position that she can remain stable in the midst of all the things that are going on. In our lives, God says he must increase and we must decrease. And that's what it says. It says it in John 3:30. It says he must increase, but I must increase. He must grow more prominent. I must grow less so. And that's really, in the end, where we really are looking for. We really, it was always, I had a man that was in my life when I was young, and he would always preach, and he would always say that. He'd say, the way up is down. It's always different than you think. If you're going to live, you must die. To be strong, you first have to become weak. You have to remove yourself. You have to allow God to come and be the very strength of who you are. You have to begin to see he's allowed us to understand those hinds' feet. He's allowed us to have that stability in our life if we allow it. But I also want to go to Joel, because I want to talk about, I've used these verses so many times. Joel 2:12, he says, therefore also now says the Lord, turn and keep on coming to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping, with mourning, until every hindrance is removed and broken fellowship is restored. That's him increasing. When we come to him and we fight through all the things that are restraining us or keeping us, all the troubles or all the sufferings or all the, the things that are around us. Now, that's what he wants us to do. But I found it interesting, because I was talking about the fig tree. So in Joel 2:21, he says, fear not, O land, be glad. And this is after we've turned, and we keep on turning. And we're changing, and he gives us that ability to change. He says in Joel 2:21 and 2:22, he says, fear not, O land, be glad and rejoice, for the Lord has done great things. Be not afraid of the wild beasts of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness have sprung up and are green. The trees bear its fruit, and the fig tree and the vine yield their full strength. See, really, as we allow the things in our lives to be dealt with, and as we endure them, as we go through them, God changes. He allows us to change. He allows us to come into those fullnesses of him. And, there's no better example than the Bible than Job. Job was a rich man. But within Job, we really see how the devil works. We really see how he attacks the saints. It's important to realize that Job was a righteous man. But yet he was not immune to suffering. And in James 5:11, he says, you know how we call these blessed happy who were steadfast. There's that steadfast. Who endured. Remember, that's that enduring. You have heard of the endurances of Job. You've seen the Lord's purpose and how he richly blessed him in the end, inasmuch as God is full of pity, compassion, tenderness, and mercy. That's what God is. That's who he is. And we see how Job endured. He went through. Satan came and attacked him. He attacked him in every way. His body, his finance, his family. In Job 36, he was bound with feathers. It says fetters. He says, and in verse 8, he says, if we are bound in feathers of adversity and held by cords of affliction, he said, God then shows to them, because that's what we need to understand here. He shows us who are true character. So why are we enduring? Why are all those things coming our way? Why do we have to go through all these things? So God can show us who our true character is. So God can deal with us. He wants to purify us. He wants us to become the very vessels that he always saw us as. He says, then he shows them the true character of their deeds in their transgressions and how they have acted arrogantly with presumption and self-sufficiency. Boy, if that wasn't me, I was constant in my self-sufficiency. And then he says he opens their ears, though, for instruction. And he commands them to return from their iniquity. That's his cry for us. And he says if we'll obey him, we'll spend the days in prosperity of their years, in pleasantness and joy. But he says if you obey them not, they'll perish by the sword of God's destructive judgment. And they shall die in their ignorance of true knowledge. They'll die in our self-sufficiency because we never saw what God really intended for us. But he said the godless and the profane in heart heap up anger at divine discipline. They don't want discipline. They don't cry to him when he binds them with cords of affliction. They try in their self-sufficiency to break that. They try to do what they want to do. Well, it's okay. I'll just press through in their control. They don't cry out to him. They don't ask God to help them. They say they die in their youth, and their life perishes among the unclean, those who are sodomites. He says, desire not the night when people are cut off from their places. Take heed, turn not to iniquity. For this, the iniquity of the complaining against God, you have chosen, rather than submission in affliction. So many times when that affliction comes, we go, why me, God? Why do I got to do it? Or why don't I not have what he has? Why am I not over here? But the whole time God is using that very affliction. If we'll just endure, he says, if you endure it like Job, if you allow yourself to come through, you'll be that much stronger. We've watched it as a church. We watched the persecution come. We watched the attacks. We watched the things. That we've watched what you would have thought would have brought a church and crumbled it. We've watched the church get much stronger. We watched the church get, not just in itself stronger, but we've watched the people get stronger. I've watched it in my own life. Because, you're there and you see it and you just sit there sometimes like, what are they talking about? Who are they talking about? Yet you just plow through and you endure in God, and God makes you that much stronger, and he takes you to that next level. He says, indeed, God would have allured you out of the mouth of distress into a broad place where there is no situation or perplexity or privation, and that which you set on your table would become full of fatness. That's what God wants. If we'll endure and get through and do what he wants for us, he says that fatness will be there. Otherwise, the fullness, that prosperity of God. But if you like Job are filled with a judgment, because for that moment he was filled with a judgment till he realized it. He says, let not wrath entice you into scorning chastisements, and let not greatness of ransom, the suffering, if rightly endured, turn you aside. You want to be going to endure what is there. And this is what he says. He says, will you cry out? Will you cry be sufficient to keep you from distress? Or will you force it of your own strength to do it? God wants us to cry out to him. He wants us, to look to him in the midst of it. He doesn't want to try, I'm tough, I can endure it. I've been through all of these things, and, I know how to get through this. And no, he wants us to cry out to him. Jesus, this is an important thing for my life. Jesus, when he was in the wilderness in Matthew, one of the temptations that Jesus did, and truthfully, that Satan did to Jesus, we ourselves, have watched it, and especially in my own life. This is one of my testimonies. Jesus, again, the devil took him up. Matthew 4:8. Again, the devil took him up. This is the third of the temptations, on a very high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world, the glory and the splendor, the magnificence, the preeminence of the excellence of them. And he said to him, these things all taken together I will give you, if you will prostrate yourself before me and do homage and worship me. But Jesus didn't accept it. He said to him, begone, Satan, for it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him alone you shall serve. The devil departed from him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. He offered him everything. It was it was there. He could have had anything he wanted. But Jesus said no. He said, no, you be gone. And what happened when he was gone? The angels came and ministered to him. I want to tell you a story. I need to probably tell it quickly. Time is going. But when I was in the music business, the only thing that, everybody in the music business, the only thing they ever wanted, they wanted to get the Christian music, especially I'm talking about the contemporary. They always thought the place where you arrived, the place where you came, was when you finally got accepted by the world. When the world finally said, what you're doing is good, we want to be part of it, we want to sell your product, so yes. And there came a point in time in my life where, the record companies that we had and all that, we finally achieved that. We finally received a distribution arrangement with A&M Records out of New York. And along with it came many other things. And we were starting to distribute product through the secular market. And, we thought we had arrived. We thought we had come. We thought this is it. Now we can just promote Jesus that much further. We were so deceived. We didn't really understand. And we'd come into a place where we had a relationship with Sony Films. And Sony Films had then, because of our distribution deal with A&M, had said to us, we want you to do our soundtracks. So we started doing some soundtracks. Then a major opportunity came, and it was a soundtrack to a specific movie. And with that, there was also a secular group that was getting back together for the first time in years. And so we would be able to produce a record for them, and that record would become the soundtrack to this movie. So we had gathered at the Sony building in New York, and you just think, hey, we're here now, look. We're in the middle of New York. We're in the Sony building. We're in their huge, it was a large preview room. And in there was the head of Sony and all the different producers and all that. And we sat down, and the movie started to play. And as we watched the movie, the credits rolled. And there it was, our logo. Okay, we had made it. Look at that. And the movie started to play. And as the movie played, it got worse and worse. You know, it was an R-rated film, but it was far more than an R-rated film. You know, it was nothing but depravity. You know, and so here we were. You know, and the whole time I'm sitting there, God says to me, "You sold your soul. You've given up everything to have this." And I turned next to the guy to me and I said, "We sold our soul." You know, and here we are. God, you know, could have brought us out, and he did. It was not long after, and I'll say it quickly because I'm at the end, it was not long after that God brought me here and started an incredible deliverance of my life, because there was still that little bit of God that was left in me, even though I'd sold my soul to everything that I believed in at one time. Thanks for being here today. I know I'll get to see you again. But in the meantime, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8:30, as all my friends come and they share their lives, or go to our website at wordoffaithfellowship.org and find us there. Thank you.